So we're very fortunate to have great artists and a great art historian with us here to reflect on this topic and to reflect on the Jack Kirby exhibition. On the far end is Vanessa Davis. She's an illustrator and cartoonist here in Los Angeles, and I know her work best from two wonderful collections of her comics, the first called Spaniel Rage, and the second called Make Me a Woman. She has contributed to quite a few comics anthologies in print and done extensive work online, and you can find out more about Vanessa's work at her website, spanielrage.com. Sitting next to Vanessa is another Los Angeles-based artist, Sammy Harcum, born and raised here in LA. And Sammy is renowned both for the seminal comics anthology, Kramer's Ergot, and for his own ongoing comic book series, Crickets. His first collection of comic stories, Everything Together, won the LA Times Book Festival Graphic Novel Prize back in 2012, I think. And more recently, his graphic novel, Blood of the Virgin, which is a mind-bogglingly good book, came out in 2023, has been recognized with nominations again for the LA Times Book Prize and for the very prestigious Angoulême Book of the Year Prize at the French Comics Festival. So thank you, Sammy. And then right next to me here is Dan Nadel. Dan is the Stephen and Ann Ames Curator of Drawings and Prints at the Whitney Museum of American Art in New York. And Dan has written a number of books and curated or co-curated many exhibitions. Most recently, I'm aware of 60 Surreal, that massive survey at the Whitney that closed recently. Dan's most recent book, Crumb, A Cartoonist's Life, which came out last year, is very widely considered one of the best ever biographies of a cartoonist. I certainly think so. It happens that Dan is now writing a biography of Jack Kirby. Please join me in welcoming these three guests. Did you all see the Kirby exhibition today? Did you see it?
I saw it in November, and then again today.
Yeah.
Yeah, I saw it before.
It's really busy in there today. It's packed.
It's very busy with people, yes.
Yeah, so any weird surprises in the exhibition from your point of view?
I mean, for me, each period of Kirby's career is surprising. Mm-hmm. You know, to see what he's doing in the 40s to the 50s, how he transitions with the culture, how he, how he sort of responds to the changes within the industry. And at the core of all that is still this very singular, bespoke artist. Mm-hmm. So you see him sort of adjusting to things, but it's always him. It always feels intensely personal.
He has this sort of opportunistic nature where he will steer into whatever is timely, and yet somehow whatever comes out the other end of that filter is always very Kirby, and it comes out the other end, right? So, I take your point about him kind of adjusting to the culture. Vanessa, do you have thoughts about the exhibition?
I mean, a lot of thoughts. For me, it was, I got to take a deep look at it last week, and it kind of what we were all talking about, where the breadth of his output with the level of craftsmanship and just kind of the speed at which he had to be producing was, today, and Sammy and I were talking about how that was him like working automatically is really kind of a lot to think about.
There is an automatic writing aspect to this. Dan, you said 60 hours a week was his average?
I think so, yeah, about 60 hours a week.
And so the amount of ideas coming out in those 60 hours, and then he's not working off scripts.
No.
So this is a level of creativity that's just so unique. And most people who are working like that in comics are not producing interesting stuff. Like, you hit the end of the road pretty quickly.
And you hit the end of the road pretty quickly at a certain age. And that was the other thing that we were sort of marveling at today. Like, that amazing Black Panther splash page towards the end of the show. is from 1978, so he's 61 at that point, which is sort of not that it's not old, but in cartoonist years, it kind of is, because
He
usually
would have been doing it for 40 years.
he would have been at it for 40 years at
Yeah,
that point, and it's as vibrant and inventive as anything else before it, and that was sort of shocking in a way. And also the level of individual detail in each of the faces, it's kind of mind-blowing that he wasn't phoning it in, like he wasn't capable of phoning it in even with the dumbest concept. You know, he just that vision just came through.
Vanessa, you were going to say?
No.
I thought. I mean, one of the things you talk about not phoning it in, it just, I mean, Kirby would introduce himself or style himself as a storyteller and someone whose job was, yes, to tell stories and to make sales. And some people have this real functionalist kind of view of comic art that essentially it sells a story and that is its primary, if not its only, important quality. And yet Kirby's so obviously delivering stuff that's surplus to requirements in terms of narratively. He's working under a deadline and he's making staggering drawings like that Black Panther image that you mentioned. It's like he seemed to be incapable of not throwing himself at it so completely, right? So, and even people who don't have a yen for those particular kinds of stories sometimes just get a contact high from being in the presence of that work, right? So, yeah, in my classes we've been studying Kirby lately, and we've only managed to get up to barely into the 1950s, and so. Which is like the first couple of turns in the exhibition as you go into it, and then just seeing, students are kind of staggered to see what is to come in some ways. I mean, he's perpetually working under deadline, right? Jack Kirby is one of those few artists that we can point to and say that he helps us have this conversation about comic books as not just an industry, but an art form. It's a cruel industry, it's kind of a shameless industry, it's a deadline-driven industry, and it's a despised medium. It's a medium that, in Kirby's heyday, many people didn't like to talk about the fact that they worked in that field, and yet somehow he managed to wring this art that was very singular out of it. I want to ask any of you and all of you, about any tension you might feel between this sort of industrial aspect and that artistry, whether it conveyed in Kirby's work in general or what you saw in the exhibition. Industry and art.
Me? Yeah, I mean, the tension is that, like you said in the beginning, there's this amazing thing where he touches and in some ways sometimes reshapes every genre that he comes across. And he has to hit those genres because those are the genres that are selling or popular or whatever. So the tension is that he's constantly attached to, it's the Western, it's the romance, it's the superhero, it's sci-fi, it's 2001, like it's just every single thing. And the tension comes through because you can see that he can't stop himself from expressing the patterns that he wanted to draw and the kinds of explosions and the kinds of technologies he wanted to render, but it had to be kind of caught up in a particular container, which he's constantly kind of stretching. He's always pushing against the container. So the real tension in the work is that, and also that a lot of it is hard to read because it wasn't meant to be reread. Like there was never any intention that somebody would ever read X-Men number whatever is on the wall, like they'd ever read it again. So these things were completely disposable. So you kind of now in this context or in reprints, you look at them and you think, God, this doesn't make any sense, and it's kind of painful. But if you actually, then what I've started doing is I've stopped reading it and just reading the words and just sort of read the pictures, and then the incredible thing happens where you realize he actually didn't need the words. Like he was such a good sort of nuts and bolts storyteller that the narrative flows without any need for dialogue. And that's been kind of an interesting thing. And also, the dialogue, the stories are rote genre stories until he gets into the New Gods and stuff in the 70s. But it's, there's always that tension of like genre. Do you like Westerns? Do you like romance? And how much do you get to see his personality come through? And that's the fun of it.
Yeah, I would say that the thing that I found kind of hardest to identify is which is it? Is it that he is working automatically and just sort of like this machine, like a visual machine, or is he imbuing it with some sort of personal sensibility? It's like, because he's kind of doing both at once. And I know that for me, when I've worked on assignment, there's something about it being an assignment that kind of I find very restrictive, and so I get more conservative with my stylistic, decisions, and it sucks, like, compared to work that I'm doing for myself. And so it's clear that he was kind of doing this for himself, but also but also doing it for.
Well, I think it's these. We talked about this before. The closest corollary with these artists, to me, is looking at newspaper journalists or columnists. A columnist has space to do what they want to do, but it's within the confines of a very tight deadline, and they need to satisfy a readership. So, and it's a very unpretentious, journeyman type approach to being an artist. They didn't consider themselves artists the way a fine arts painter or a novelist thinks of. They feel like they're much more blue collar craft. You know what I mean? They had a hard time calling themselves artists, at least in the first part of their
there's a certain
careers.
Abandonment that you or I don't know if abandon is the right word, but
there's a language like some of the great writers of the 20th century were all writing on deadline for columns, and there's an abandonment that kicks in because you have this space, you have this subject, and you just kind of have to go for it.
Yeah, you
or
have
like
to
Samuel Fuller. We've talked about Samuel Fuller as sort of an interesting filmmaker, who's an interesting parallel to Kirby, who fought in World War II and came back and was always working in genres and just had to produce these things. And it's a sensibility that's so strong that you can't turn it off.
Well, it's
so
also,
no matter what he touches, it's touched.
It's also thinking about, he's working in a commercial pop culture, commercial field where the individual is not supposed to be, it's not supposed to be self-expression. That's an idea that enters in the mid-'60s, right? Wouldn't you say with Dylan? Right?
In pop culture?
In pop culture, you don't see this idea of like the auteur filmmaker in commercial film yet. Like all these things are happening in the mid-'60s. That people start identifying that. And authenticity of the artist, right? Of someone like Dylan, even though there isn't a lot of authenticity. It's like people want a realness. So Kirby is part of this wave of it's working within this commercial construct, and their personality is, like Carl Barks on the Duck Story.
Carl Barks is a great example.
Readers of this stuff at the time are just like, who is this guy? I mean,
they
were
can
credited.
tell. They can tell it's different.
But even in the 40s and 50s, Kirby is carving out a readership that's unique compared to a lot of other cartoonists at that time.
Well, yeah. I mean, when the Simon and Kirby sort of brand name is attached to advertising in comic books like immediately.
But
after
what does
World
that
War
advertising
II.
look like? Is that to retailers or newsstands or what?
It's to newsstands and house ads where they're saying Simon and Kirby are back, and But it was still it was like a mark of quality as opposed to a mark of sensibility.
But to go back to what you're saying, I think when you and I get asked to do an illustration or a story for work for hire, it's so unusual for us. Whereas for Kirby and that group, it was like, that was it. That was all of it.
That was the whole thing.
That was the whole thing. That any of their personal DNA ended up in that work was almost a byproduct, at least to the person who's purchasing.
It also seems, this is an assumption on my part, but I would imagine that someone with like that kind of technical facility that he had would feel like he could kind of do whatever he wanted and it would turn out good. You know, it would meet the standards of what was expected.
He's such a weird artist.
Yes, he is.
He's not like a Wally Wood or like
Or a Kurt Swan.
Yeah, he's
Like,
weird. That's
not
the
a-
thing that's amazing is how
Yeah,
weird he is.
yeah.
And he's weird in the mid-40s, he's weird.
But there was
He's
a
weird
lot
from
of,
the jump.
I mean,
Right,
Yeah,
he's
yeah.
weird. He's got a weird line and
Yeah.
it's interesting to me that
It's
he
sort
was
of
doing,
ugly, you know, early on, and kind of
still doing those mouths. Those
those
weird-
mouths.
yeah, the
Vanessa
mouths.
hates the way he
I
draws
was complaining.
mouths.
Yeah, I'm not a fan of his mouths.
Yeah.
What about the hands?
Those chunky hands.
I mean, I have a chunky hand, but like he's got like this, like, it's like they're all curled up. They're
I was
like,
going to ask all of you, you know, what about it, Kirby's art draws you to it, and what, if anything, also sort of pushes you away from it? Because it's like a scorpion pepper sort of style. I mean, it's a strong sort of thing.
It's interesting to me that it was so accepted by mainstream comic book readers. To me, it has more of a relationship to like E.C. Seeger or like an artist like today, like Ron Rigi. You know, like where it looks like he's not referencing anything in reality. It feels like a language that's totally his. And it's interesting that he's doing that early, but I guess it's so dynamic that that's what people are responding to.
That's what they responded
That
to
it can be that
from the
abstract.
jump in the early 40s. It was this incredible dynamism of, you know, people punching through panels and
who
going
else is
across
doing stuff like
pages.
that in the 40s, you think? For the comic books.
Jack Cole with Plastic Man.
And Eisner.
Eisner.
But there aren't many, right? A lot of them are just doing kind of flat.
Jimmy Thompson, Robot Man. But yeah, not, I mean, we could go really pathetically
His stuff is
deep.
weird. He's
But
a weird drawer.
it was weird drawing, and it was drawing kind of, that was, you just get the sense he wasn't going to not do it that way. Like, he couldn't rein it in.
It feels very unself-conscious, and it feels like a closed circuit. Like he's in a dialogue with himself.
Well,
he's not thinking of Alex Raymond. He's not thinking of Hal Foster. He must
thought
have
of it
been.
early
He must
on.
have
He
been.
thought of them
Didn't
early
get
on.
there. Didn't get there.
And he kind of, that was the standard in Kniff.
Yeah, he thought of artists whose work was more beautiful than his own, frankly.
Yeah.
And he tried to hit that. So if you look at like really early Kirby, you can see there's sort of this inking sheen, and it's very like, Flash Gordon-y. You know, it's like really beautiful. But he was just crushed or propelled or fueled by deadlines so much that the style is a reflection of the frantic pace at which he worked, and because like you said, 60 hours, right? So we would hear that Hal Foster would spend 60 hours a week drawing one Prince Valiant Sunday page for the Sunday Funnies page. I mean, fortunately for Hal Foster, that's all that he needed to do as an artist, and he would pour himself into that. Kirby was doing God knows how many pages and stories in those 60 hours. So the whole style was pressurized to the point where it does turn into this.
But there is this added thing that you look at when you're looking through it in person. It's a pressurized style that comes out of that deadline, but he's loving it. Me and Dan were looking
Yeah,
at some
he's
of that
clearly on like a roller coaster of his own.
stuff. He's doing stuff that he isn't necessary.
Totally
to the page.
unnecessary
He's
machines.
in his own rut. Like,
Yeah.
Graphomania. I mean, he is in it.
And I don't think, even, let's say I don't think he would have been capable of doing just a Sunday page. I mean, he's a guy he needs to cycle through the ideas.
Well, one
Like
thing I was thinking when we were talking about being like a columnist is with a column, everyone isn't going to be amazing. You might do some that are duds, but what you look at overall is the complete, work. And so if he's looking at that, I don't know, I just feel like that might have affected the way he approached what he was doing, because he was like, all the stakes aren't just in this one page or this one panel or this one project.
Exactly.
Well, that's why the medium attracted and probably still does attract a lot of hacks, because there aren't anybody paying attention.
There's no stakes.
Yeah, there's no stakes. You can do whatever, but he's in an intense dialogue with himself, so that when he's finishing his work for the day, he still wants to move that pencil around. So then he starts making art for himself.
Starts making collages.
Yeah, it's like he's already done
can't
15
stop.
hours today.
Yeah.
He's in that zone. He likes living inside that space.
There's a violence in it too, though. I think, if you enter the Kirby exhibition, you see this evocation of the Lower East Side in the 1920s. He's growing up. It's from his great 10-page story that he did so late in his career called Street Code. The Street Code's all about fighting in gangs. And implicitly, these are sort of ethnically defined gangs, different blocks that fight. So these kids are like, we got a block fight. And they pick up bricks and bottles and corn cobs and stones, and they are ready to hurt one another. And it's such a crucible of life. I mean, if we think about a lot of our maybe stereotypic images of New York City as a port of call for immigrants or a place of settlement for immigrants come from the Lower East Side, and they come from that 1880s, 1890s into the 1910s, 20s. This is maybe the most densely populated set of blocks on planet Earth at the time. It is squalid, it is intense, it is rife with crime, big and small, and Kirby fought and fought and fought. And he told Will Eisner, his sometime boss years later, another very celebrated Jewish American comics pioneer, he said, when I was drawing those fights, I had to get a real fight on the page. I had to get a real fight in, and I knew what that felt like, right? Just, by all accounts, almost always a very genial person in reality, but there just seems to be so much animating rage in these comics. He's like a poet of violence in a way. And I wonder about that, and I wonder if you have any reactions to that, either in the content or the work or the style, that this ambient violence is there.
I mean, we were talking earlier, Dan and I, about his interest. It's like superheroes. He could bend that genre, which would have been a commercial edict put on by his publishers. Mm-hmm. He could bend it towards sort of Greek myth. He was obviously interested in form and movement and power and speed. And so you could see he in all that 70s stuff, right? The New Gods, is that what it's called? I haven't read that material, but it seems like he could just push all this commercial stuff towards this. He seemed that he liked very elemental, physical sort of ideas. And he called himself a storyteller. So he liked the idea of writing fable-like things. And of course, he would have grown up in a world where violence was very common.
Well, violence and religion. I mean, there's this story he would tell later on in life that when he was young, he had, I think it was pneumonia. Don't quote. Yeah, he had some terrible illness, and his mother brought in the rabbis, and the rabbis stood around him and healed him. And he was in bed for days. I mean, and the sort of the Jewish mystic text, and also the Yiddishkeit culture he grew up in, that's really baked into this sort of mythology that he's building out. I mean, it's always in there.
Was his father religious? Was his mother religious?
They were both religious.
They were?
Oh, yeah.
How many siblings did he have?
He had one brother who died very young. I mean, maybe his brother died in his 20s, maybe, something like that. Young. And his father died young. Okay. So the mother was sort of holding it down. And Kirby he dropped out of high school to work, to draw, to support the family, because his father was in and out of work. So I think there's always, the fighting thing is baked in, and I think he, while a genial guy, the flip side of that is the sort of whatever kind of PTSD after the war, and he was known to punch holes in walls.
Yeah, there's violence, but there's also just kind of like the action and the dynamism that you're talking about, and there's just kind of that physicality. What it makes me think about is if he grew up fighting, and that was kind of this period in his life where he was like young and vital and violent, and when I think about how I like to draw, and I like to think about my own youth and energy, and I wanted to dance. I wanted to be I was a little girl that wanted to be a dancer, and I was never going to be a dancer. So there's like a lot of that harnessing your own like internal kind of aspirational physicality when you're drawing sometimes, and to, you're like inhabiting the action that you wish you were taking.
Like
kind
Pfeiffer's dancer, right?
Yeah,
'Cause
yeah.
He was never a dancer, but he was constantly,
Yes, and
aspirational.
I think sometimes like you might not be a dancer, but you might have kind of some connection to your body and the way you want to translate that feeling, into your imagery. And just kind of hearing that story, I heard the story that the docent was telling about during the Bund rally, and how he was so excited because he thought that there were going to be some Nazis in the lobby and he wanted to punch them out or something. And I get that. He was so ready to kind of, but that's like a personality thing, right? And it's also like a personal history thing. So he had that kind of
He looks like the Thing.
Yeah.
Is that the character? The Thing, the Rock?
Yeah.
That's what that to me is like the
He's a
most
short,
autobiographical looking.
short, stocky
There's a
guy.
Yeah, so he wanted to put that energy into his.
Yeah.
Great image in a late Fantastic Four he did around the end of the 60s. He was probably already planning his exit. He'd had enough of that. But there's this image where the Thing, who looks kind of like a broken terracotta flower pot that's been badly glued back together, and he's got this rocky skin, and he has this entire brownstone, like this gigantic tenement building resting on his shoulders, and people are just he's holding this building up, and he's like, it's not like I can do this all day long, he says. And you almost feel like this is Kirby kind of bearing up under the weight of that history, because usually his skyline in Fantastic Four is sleek, it's high tech, it's like it inspires like the retro futurist imagery of the recent Fantastic Four film and all that. But then he has these like broken down neighborhoods in these kind of just like textured cobble.
He loves cobblestones and he loves bricks.
loves that.
That's what I noticed today. It's a lot of
Like
bricks.
high-tech characters who are born under weight of like crumbling things. It feels like, well, this is him, right?
Cobblestones and muscles are like the same.
Yeah, especially for him.
Just bump. Yeah, like you.
Right. But I wanted to ask both you and Sammy about bodies, because every cartoonist who thrives has a way with bodies that is their own, right? They have whether that's really based on whether it's really referential, or if it's just kind of like if you're looking at reference, or if it's imagined bodies. And I see that like particularly vibrant in your cartooning, Vanessa, like the way bodies are depicted. Sammy has a different way with it. And like these violent genre comics, like superhero comics, are really about moving bodies around the page. That's where a lot of their interest, I think, visually comes from. And I don't know if we have images of Vanessa's work or Sam's work that we can show, but it feels like each year has a different language for the body, or a different body language. And just, if you have thoughts about that, like how you've come to draw bodies in certain ways, and whether you see any kinship or real difference between you and what Kirby was doing.
I like this.
What is this straight page?
What is this one?
Oh, it's about Trevor not being Jewish.
Oh, good. Where did this run? I never saw this.
In Tablet a long time ago.
Oh, cool. So drawing the body.
Drawing the body, you're filling up, you're trying to make dynamic compositions, and you're writing about people, so their bodies have to be making the shapes that make the compositions dynamic.
It's almost like those panels are a habitat for bodies. That's mostly what you see in comics, is occasionally you'll see panels with places or abstract imagery or other things, but usually, most often, it's a habitat for bodies. You're going to put bodies into those panels, right?
Yeah.
Dynamism.
But the thing with Kirby is that the bodies, the motion, the backgrounds, they all look like they're made from the same material. He's thinking in terms of design. It's all of a piece, It's the only thing he's not doing is lettering. But if the guy was a cartoonist now, it's a completely different world. That's the other thing with Kirby. It's hard to remove him from his moment. It's so unique. Like the Lower East Side being what it was then, which very quickly, pretty soon it wasn't. The next decade, it's totally different than what he grew up in. To him going to the war, the industry being what it is. I mean, it's all these things that are so.
There's also just a level of craftsmanship that was expected in everything.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
like in clothing, in bottles of milk, you know, that
Talking about it the other night.
in t-shirts,
Yeah.
like everything, you know, everything had kind of a base level standard of like masterful.
That's why after they would photograph it, they would just like throw it away.
Throw
Yeah.
it away because there was so much of it.
Like,
So it
too
was
much
like-
art.
It was a storage problem.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
You know, there are all those cartoonists who notoriously kept filing cabinet after filing cabinet of like morgue photos for photo reference, but this was not Kirby. This was not a way that he was operating.
Yeah. What was his?
Yeah.
Did he ever have a reference file?
I think if he had photos in hand, he was likely to cut them up with a pair of scissors. I mean,
Right.
You know, and make those
Right.
collages out of them. At some point,
Did he just have like a photographic memory? Though there's also there was an article that just came out recently where they were talking about different people's abilities to visualize in their memory, and how there are, you know, with artists, how that can really manifest itself strangely, because some people can visualize things perfectly and they can just look at what's going on in their head. But if you don't have that way of, if your mind doesn't do that, then you are kind of SOL, and you have to look at different things for reference, and that introduces kind of new entry points for.
It looks like Kirby's just looking for forms that he likes.
Yeah, but it seems like he remembers what things look like.
But what? Nothing. He's never drawing like a
There's like a
Buick from
there's a certain-
'73.
there's a certain
No,
kind
there's
of
a lot of
window.
architectural stuff that he's drawing.
I feel like it's all
all
just
made up.
a memory. It's an idea of a living room. It's an idea.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know that I would
I don't know.
draw it like that if I was just remembering.
Well, I mean,
I don't
it is
think-
pretty
I think you
staggering.
can tell
that,
I wouldn't.
That image of the Lower East Side neighborhood that opens the exhibition, to think that he probably executed that without reference.
He had a photograph.
He had a photograph
for that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
because
to
that's
remember.
I mean, all
because
those fire
it's
escapes,
too
all
it's
those.
too specific.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the thing that's so amazing about him is like most of the time, with that exception, the specificity in all the work is that it's Kirby, like it's his language.
I don't draw a gun. I draw an idea of a gun.
Yeah, exactly. It's a Kirby gun.
Right. Although
And
sometimes if you're working on a war comic fans like fetishize material and munitions. I was talking with one of the docents about this earlier, and there you have to like, okay, you have to get photo reference because you have to get the gun or the tank right, because war comics readers love that kind of thing.
Right.
I think that what Sammy said, he's looking for forms. There is a way in which he's referencing things that are available to him, but it's a weird way. Like he might look at an egg beater or a toaster or a radio cabinet, and then that shape shows up in something like the Dream Machine, like this image, right? So who knows
Right.
how many...
And this is not. We should tell the audience just to remind them. This was not.
This was just for
commissioned
fun.
work.
Yeah.
This was Kirby for fun in his copious spare time, apparently.
One thing this I think is a great example of is one thing I noticed in his work is just sort of like an inability to get to the floor. Like there's just, you know, like the
It's full.
yeah, it's full, and so he's just sort of like filling. And I know that when I've done my drawing is not. I don't have the same facility that he had, but when you're trying to kind of handle space when you don't know where the bottom is, you kind of start working in terms of form and pattern and texture.
This is what-
And it seems
yeah.
like he kind of like never knew where the bottom was.
Eddie Campbell, the Scots cartoonist, had this facetious rule. He said, like, a good comic is where you can see at least a pair of feet on every page. And I don't know if he really meant that, but the idea is that you would draw a whole figure and ground it somewhere so you would actually see some feet, so you'd see where the bottom is. But Kirby gets so close to subjects and then crops them like mad. He just kind of crops them ruthlessly. Like, so here's this much of a person's face in the foreground. Here's the top of some other anonymous person's
Well,
head.
that's what it was like for him growing up. I mean, you're in a very crowded, tenement building. Everything is in your face. You know, that was his view of life until, and then when he's working, he's, either in his basement or like the living room at a drawing table, just there. And so everything is super close up and intense, and there's not this sort of, it makes sense, I guess, is what I
the thought
mean.
about
Like,
not finding the floor, not finding
Yeah,
the bottom.
that's great.
And I mean, maybe it's partly why the work feels so closely packed and immersive, but also sometimes a little airless and intimidating because there's just so much of that detail that you all mentioned early on.
Well, yeah, you're like, where are they? You know, you can't even tell, like, what is even happening? You know, and
It's amazing.
I know that sometimes I will use that almost as like, I can just kind of, I'm sort of like on the opposite end of the spectrum where I'm like, do the littlest, you know, that you can to get the idea across of what's happening. And then like nobody has to know how well or how not well you can draw it, right? But there's, you know, you can make these suggestions of places, but the way he does it, it's so full you can't even tell like if they're in a room or what the room is or what the space is that they're, because it's all so close up, but then it stays kind of close up even as the space recedes.
I mean, it's an amazing magic trick. Like looking at the pages today, you just think there's such clarity. There shouldn't be any clarity. It should be a mush.
Yeah.
But it all really, it's highly delineated. It's sharp, even though it is crazy dense. Unique.
Crazy
Very
dense
unique.
is a good description of it, I think. So, I mean, Sammy, you had said years ago that you finally copped to the kind of, you glommed onto the idea that drawing was design, and it didn't matter whether a hand looked like this hand. It just mattered that a hand was consistently designed for a cartoonist. And I mean, do any of you have a sense of like the changing design language in Kirby? Like, you said he was chasing after form.
He's interesting because, like, you see a lot of cartoonists over the decades, they get more interested in their line as design, and it
Well,
becomes
Sammy's work behind you.
and
Yeah.
it gets more refined. It usually gets more simple, but Kirby doesn't. That's one direction, right? Another direction is more. Cartoonists will often become more realistic. They'll get interested in the craft, where they want to figure out like realistic lighting and realistic fold design. That's one path. There's this one where they get more simple. Kirby does this thing where it is becoming more refined, more bold, but it's not becoming easier. It's not becoming a shorthand that is lazy. And what's interesting is that his language, the visual vocabulary is kind of locked in by 66, 67, but he holds it. He does a lot with that language. It's almost like, you know, Charles Burns is similar, David Lynch is similar. They have the same elements they're interested in, and they're just going to keep working with them. Kirby's interested in certain design, not tropes, but he's got a language. He likes certain shapes, and none of it looks lazy. By the time you finish the show, you're like, this guy's the ultimate artist. This guy's amazing. He doesn't feel burnt out.
No, it gets more and more baroque in a really curious way. Like,
so in that
once you're deep into the late 70s, and then you hit like Silver Star, you know, and the pages become just these sort of black and white kind of patterns. Like they almost. The last time I saw the show, I thought, well, it looks like Louise Nevelson at times. Like you're looking at this sort of black and white series of patterns and forms and shapes interlocked that happen to then resolve into Black Panther or a dinosaur. Like it's this incredible thing that's the kind of the end point, and then the beginning point is a much more linear sensibility. So if it's like
so
form,
his self-identification had to do with stories and characters and yarns that he would spin. But we've been talking about this in a very formalist kind of way, like how this art kind of works. But often when he was lured into discussion of his work, like interviews or chatting with fans, it was all story-based. Everything he would say would be story-based.
So I think of like, is it The Devil? Is that the comic?
Devil Dinosaur?
Not Devil Dinosaur.
The Demon.
The Demon.
Yeah.
So that was probably the last thing of his. That's the most recent thing of his I've read. And so you could see he's interested in pulling from, you know, King Arthur. He's interested in pulling from Hal Foster. He's looking at it as like it's all a wellspring to grab from. And he definitely looks at comics as like, oh, this is a perfect medium to tell very mythic, elemental stories. He's not trying to break the form. He's just trying to do a good job within it.
Well, in the case of the Demon, the comics code had been lightly revised. That is, the self-censorship regime that obtained for most mainstream comic books had been changed a little. It had been liberalized a little in the early 70s to allow back in horror comics and creature comics and monster comics of a certain kind that had been forbidden. And so this is one of those cases, coming back to what Dan said, you have a genre that you work in because the publisher has an edict or the publisher has an interest. So with the Demon, that publisher wanted a monster book. They wanted a monster who was also a hero. And so Kirby obliged. At the same time, Commandy, The Last Boy on Earth, the publisher wanted an imitation of Planet of the Apes, which was enormously popular at the time. And Kirby just kind of gave them Planet of the Apes on steroids. He just gave them, where all the animals except human beings were talking. Here are talking dolphins. Here are talking, and so he was always responding to some edict. Or Devil Dinosaur had this staggering image that everybody I know stops and looks at in the exhibition. Was like a notional thing, like it was gonna be maybe a Saturday morning kids cartoon that never got made. But the reason he came up with this comic with this furry ape kid and this bright red dino, a paleontology be damned, it was a fantasy. I mean, the reason he came up with it is because
it's so interesting
because
when you look at it, you're just like, it's breaking at the seams. You're like, how is this commercial? Yeah, a disposable trash for children. This is so bizarre. It was supposed to be a
Saturday morning kids cartoon,
amazing.
Right? And the result was drawings like this. So yeah, he's responding to often to specific mission briefs, like Jack, give us a horror comic. Jack, give us.
I mean, he said the thing about his interviews that's so interesting is you read those interviews, they're amazing because you're hearing him recite the story that he's also telling himself. Mm-hmm. So he never really grapples in those interviews with why he draws the way he does, why he puts so much in. Like nobody said, well, did you really have to draw that, to get the point across? Couldn't it have, it's a funny thing because I don't think that you get the sense, and there's no, as far as I know, there's no diaries, there's no sketchbooks, there's nothing that another artist would have recorded their inner thoughts in. So, he told people he was telling stories, but I think that may have been a way for him to kind of excuse the intensity of the visions and of the drawing that he had to do. And I sometimes think
that's
right?
Yeah. And also there's also just sometimes there's just sort of like a savant, like
he's
you might there's in any good artist something that they do well is kind of unexplainable even to them.
Yeah.
And you'll see artists who maybe they're these incredible draftsmen, but their ability to render isn't what is interesting to them. But people want to know how they're so able to do that. Or anyway, so that just kind of, I feel like he might have not been able to explain the marks that he was making.
I think you're right. Yeah. And I think also he's the kind of artist, and I think savant is the right word, and also because there's no equivalent in comic books for this guy, you can talk about Eisner, you can talk about all these different people, but there was nobody with this sort of the thing that we haven't really touched on is imagination, because which one is it? Oh yeah, there's an ape kid and a dinosaur, or there's Planet of the Apes, but you give it to him and he can't, the way his brain worked was he couldn't just rip something off. It's like intersecting particles or something. As soon as his brain hit something,
all the time. But
unrecognizable, and usually it's better.
Well, when I was reading Commandy, The Last Boy on Earth as a kid, one issue is King Kong, one issue is The Charge of the Light Brigade, one issue is Day of the Dolphin, one issue is a Westworld, and he's probably not even read these books or seen these films. He's just, he's responding to a notion. He's
Or
responding
he'd read a review
he's
in
responding
TV
to
Guide.
an advertisement.
Yeah.
And there seems to be a demand. And
Absolutely.
he's going to do a story in which the British bulldog in
Like
the Crimea
Gilbert
and the
Hernandez
Charge of
is
the Light
doing
Rail
that
is
now.
literally a bulldog. He's a talking bulldog, and he's going to send his troops into battle.
Yeah.
It's like the war in the Crimea. And like, who does this?
Well,
But he's just going to...
Sammy mentioned Gilbert Hernandez
Yeah.
as an interesting equivalent for right now, and I think that's kind of true. It's like he can't explain why he's doing these things,
And it all feels like riffs on a million things that
Absolutely.
feel vaguely familiar.
Yeah.
And there's also that mania of just working a lot. It's a cartooning thing.
Must put these things down. Yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned imagination, and one thing that's not like the process of coming up with ideas here is not a scriptwriter's process; it's an artist process, and that extends to whole stories and whole story worlds that he would create. Where, he would refer to what he was doing as scripting, and he would say, "I've been a writer all along. I've been a writer in pictures." But I think one reason people still talk about like superhero comics, superhero movies, all that sort of stuff that engages so many people is because Kirby made it look more vital and more sustainable than perhaps it is. He just made it look like a well that you could not hit bottom. When you see a lot of imitation faux Kirby stuff in superhero comics, you think, well, yeah, they've hit bottom. But but just looking at Kirby, you convince you that you could just carry on riffing.
Yeah, partly because people didn't recognize how unusual his visual language was. I think that's part of it. It's like that's why those movies usually fall flat, because you're using these Kirby designs and these characters, but if he's not drawing it and kind of constantly changing it and fucking with it and like making weird marks in it, then suddenly you're just looking at this weird costume.
Right, because the story isn't actually...
The story's not the
strong.
interesting part.
And he, like,
Suspension of disbelief
Yeah.
is not factoring in the same way
No.
that you need for a film.
Yeah.
The comic, you're looking at this guy's
You're looking at these
art. This guy's
in
brain.
any cartoonist, I feel like that I know, and I know a lot of cartoonists, is there's always this thing where they're like, am I a better writer or am I a better artist? And then there's always, and it's always an insult when anyone has, it's what some of the answer is, and so when you're talking about him like insisting that he was just kind of like making up stories, it rings false.
Oh, it rings true as like a neurotic response.
Yeah.
Totally.
It's like no, you were doing other stuff, but it's just kind of.
They're narratives.
Yeah.
Like the drawings, even when he's doing those.
Oh no, they got to get from
He likes.
A
He's
to B
thinking
to C.
the drawings. His art is narrative.
Yeah.
But did he do like a point form type script? What was his script? What was his actual process before
I've seen
penciling?
photos of him taking fully penciled pages in the early 70s and then having another pass at them where he just pencils dialogue into the spaces he's left available. And he doesn't seem to be referencing a typescript or a legal pad or anything else. He just seems to know what is going on.
What's the
That's
step
great.
before he draws the
Step,
drawings?
there is no step before it.
But I want to say
There
something.
must be. Are there no thumbnailed
I want to say something heretical,
typewriter?
which is I think he could write like a son of a gun. I think
I don't think that's heretical. Yeah,
there's
he's a good
there's
writer.
some stunning bits of wordsmithing and just writing as writing.
Today at the show, I was reading some of the handwritten
Like
captions. Fantastic.
Like, wow.
So
it's-
what?
it's all
You're
very
telling me
old.
that he didn't thumbnail a page on typing paper
From what
first?
everybody's said is that he'd get a board and he'd start on the top left-hand corner with pencils and just go panel to panel to panel.
Him and Robert Crumb
Yeah,
are
Crumb
the
did
two
same
people
thing.
doing this.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's
for
it.
joining us.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.